Alright, so today we're going to dive into something most folks overlook when it comes to old houses and winter time. Something I like to call the winter air rule. It might sound simple, but it's a bit of wisdom that kept our grandparents' homes standing strong year after year. If you study old houses closely, especially those built before the mid-20th century, one detail stands out immediately. Widespread mold damage was rare. Timber beams lasted generations. Plaster walls stayed solid. Floors didn't rot out after a few decades. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't better materials alone. It came down to a winter air rule that nearly every household followed without ever naming it. Once that rule was broken by modern building habits, mold became normal. This guide is written for Warfield Prepper Chronicles viewers who care about how things actually worked, not romantic stories. What follows is practical, documented building behavior that you can still apply today, whether you live in a modern house, an older structure, or are preparing a long-term retreat. Now let's get into how winter air actually moves through a house and why that matters. It's not just about drafts or cold spots. It's about the way dry, cold air interacts with the warm, moist air inside. Understanding this helps explain why those old homes stayed free of mold and how you can use the same principle even today. Winter air movement was constant, controlled, and intentional. Old homes were never sealed. During winter, cold outside air was allowed to enter the structure continuously, while warm interior air was allowed to escape just as steadily. Fireplaces, stoves, and chimneys created a natural upward draft that pulled moist air out of living spaces every hour of the day. That outgoing air carried humidity with it, whether from cooking, breathing, washing, or wet clothing. Incoming air was cold and dry by comparison. Cold air physically cannot hold the same amount of moisture as warm air. As it entered the home, it diluted indoor humidity instead of trapping it. So folks, let's talk about how you can take this old winter air rule and put it to use in your own home today. It's honestly not as complicated as it might seem at first. You can apply this today by understanding that mold prevention starts with air exchange, not chemicals or machines. Just cracking your windows for a little while during winter, keeping a good working chimney, or using passive vents. These things help bring back that same drying cycle old homes always used. The goal here isn't just warmth at all costs, but what you really want is dry warmth. See, heating methods in the past dried out the structure just as much as they warmed the folks living inside. Wood stoves, coal stoves, fireplaces, and even those old oil heaters, they all put out radiant heat that really dried up the materials around them. Floors, walls, and beams were always getting warmed and dried right from the inside out. All right, let's talk about heating methods and those cold surfaces you might be dealing with. See, the way you heat your home can really affect how moisture behaves inside. If you got cold spots on your walls or ceilings, that's where condensation likes to show up, and that can lead to all sorts of problems down the road. So, modern forced air systems, they heat up the air just fine, but a lot of times they leave your walls and other structural surfaces kind of cool. And, well, when those surfaces stay cold, condensation can start forming inside the walls where you can't even see it. That's a sneaky problem, and it's something folks don't always think about. You know, back in the day, winter heating was all about running hot and steady. Fires weren't really allowed to smolder for too long. A strong fire meant you had a strong draft, and that strong draft helped pull moisture right out of the house. That was more important than just being comfortable inside. Honestly, rooms were usually cooler than what we're used to now, but the main thing was the structure stayed dry. All right, so to put this into practice, you want to avoid low-temperature heating that just cycles on and off and leaves your walls cold. A wood stove masonry heater, or, any heat source that runs steadily, is going to keep those surfaces warm enough to stop condensation from forming. Even in modern homes, running your heat steady instead of in short bursts really cuts down on the risk of mold, big time. Now let's talk a bit about cold surfaces and how air moves around them. If you've got cold surfaces exposed to the inside air and there's good airflow, moisture doesn't get a chance to settle in and cause problems. That's why old buildings, with their exposed stone or brick, handled moisture better than you might think. Back in the day, cold surfaces were left out in the open, not hidden away. Old builders didn't cover up those cold spots with vapor-tight barriers. Stone foundations, brick walls, and big solid wood beams were all exposed to the air inside. If moisture showed up, it could just evaporate and move on. But in modern construction, we tend to trap moisture inside wall cavities where it can't go anywhere, and that's where trouble starts. In winter, old homes accepted that some areas would be cold. Instead of sealing them off, airflow passed through them. Attics were ventilated. Crawl spaces breathed. Basements stayed cool but dry because moving air carried moisture away before it could settle. If you live in a modern house, this means paying attention to closed-off spaces. Storage rooms, closets on exterior walls, and finished basements are prime mold zones because air stagnates. Introducing slow, continuous airflow solves problems that dehumidifiers only mask. Folks back then paid close attention to how their daily habits affected moisture indoors, especially during winter. They knew that even small changes, like where you dried your clothes or how often you opened a window, could make a big difference in keeping things dry and comfortable. Managing moisture was just part of living, not something you left for a machine to fix. Winter living habits reinforced the rule without technology. People lived in ways that supported the drying cycle. Wet clothes were dried near fires, not left damp indoors. Cooking was done with ventilation by default. Washing water was heated and evaporated quickly. Homes were cleaned with dry sweeping and wiping rather than saturating surfaces. Folks used to open windows even when it was downright cold outside, just to let in some fresh air. It wasn't really about comfort, it was just plain common sense. If a house smelled stale, well, people thought that meant it was unhealthy. Fresh winter air, believe it or not, was seen as kind of protective. Now, with all this modern insulation, things have really changed. By sealing up our homes tighter than ever, we've accidentally created the perfect conditions for mold to take off. It's like the more we try to keep the cold out, the more trouble we invite in with trapped moisture and all that. So, applying this knowledge today means we've got to respect where moisture comes from in our homes. Exhaust fans, for example, should really vent to the outdoors, not just into the attic. And, drying laundry inside without any ventilation, that's just asking for a mold problem. Honestly, short bursts of fresh air exchange do a better job than keeping everything sealed up for hours. Modern insulation, well, it kind of broke the old rule by trapping all that moisture inside. Well, the mold explosion of the last 50 years lines up directly with tighter homes, plastic vapor barriers, and energy efficiency measures that ignored moisture movement. Heat stayed in, but so did water vapor. Walls became dew point traps. Mold followed. Old homes, they leaked air by design. Modern homes fight leaks without providing escape paths for moisture. The forgotten rule was simple. Moisture must always have a way out during winter. Once that exit was blocked, decay became, well, inevitable. All right, let's wrap this up with some practical advice you can actually use and a few final thoughts to bring it all together. Preppers should take this seriously. A sealed retreat that grows mold is a failed retreat. Food storage, ammunition, tools, and health all suffer in damp environments. Airflow is as critical as insulation. So, practical application for modern survival-minded households. In winter, prioritize controlled ventilation over maximum sealing. Allow slow, intentional air exchange. Keep heating steady enough to warm structural surfaces. Avoid creating cold pockets with stagnant air. And, accept slightly cooler indoor temperatures if it means dryness. Monitor humidity, not just temperature. If winter indoor humidity rises above safe levels, something is wrong. Old homes stayed dry because winter air was used as a tool, not an enemy. This knowledge scales from a suburban house to a cabin to a long-term off-grid shelter. The materials may change, but the physics do not. Old homes didn't beat mold by accident. They followed a winter air rule that worked because it respected how moisture actually behaves. Relearning it gives you durability, health, and resilience that modern shortcuts cannot replace. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles. Share this with others who care about historical skills that still work, and help keep this kind of practical knowledge alive.